is the news that Trump's most pivotal White House lawyer, the man literally at the white-hot center of the Russia probe, as well as at the center of the warnings about Mike Flynn, as well as at the center of the efforts to oust Jeff Sessions and Rod Rosenstein and even Bob Mueller himself, that man, White House counsel Don McGahn, is out. That is the news tonight. Axios first reported it today, that he has plans to exit in the fall, and then Donald Trump rushed to get on top of that scoop, tweeting that McGahn is leaving. So we can also report tonight something about that tweet that is somewhat typical of this White House. Sources saying McGahn didn't even know Donald Trump was announcing his exit that way. Now, McGahn has a job that is high power, but honestly low visibility. In fact, it was in one of his very rare public interviews at CPAC when he explained how he was directly appointed by Trump and how much he gets to touch in this post.
The counsel to the president is a appointed position directly answerable to the president. It is not a career spot. I am appointed by President Trump. It is the primary legal advisor to the president.
And that involves you in just about everything?
Unfortunately, yes.
Unfortunately, yes. A little candor there about not wanting to do all the legal everything in this White House. And there is something here that actually is a point of rare agreement from Trump allies and critics alike. In the crime-riddled Trump world, everyone knows McGahn is critical. In fact, today, the top Republican on the Judiciary Committee was basically begging for him to stay on. Others have noted how McGahn could hurt Trump because he was so close to so many potentially criminal acts under investigation.
To be honest with you, this is something that I've noticed. There have been a lot of stories that have broken over the past week or two that cast White House counsel Don McGahn as the superhero who is saving the republic. This is another one of those stories where Don McGahn, White House counsel, is the only man standing between America and the abyss.
Today's news comes after Trump's week from legal hell, which featured not only the convictions of his top lawyer and former campaign chief, but also, remember, after that provocative New York Times report detailing how the White House was blindsided over just how much McGahn had told Mueller's investigators in up to 30 hours of certainly interesting interviews. Mueller looking at what McGahn knew as the first top White House official briefed on Michael Flynn's crime, which he confessed to of lying to the FBI, as well as Trump's pressure on McGahn over getting Jeff Sessions to either take over the Russia probe or potentially leave the administration. Plus, there were, of course, the clashes with James Comey and other acts that could be obstruction or even ignite an existential crisis for Trump's presidency, because when you take it all together, it was McGahn who Trump was pushing to do his dirty work and try to fire Mueller. McGahn reportedly refused. That's the leak Rachel was just referring to, an act of alleged bureaucratic heroism that found its way to the newspapers. And if the story's good enough for them, you can bet it's good enough to tell Bob Mueller. So how does the president feel today about McGahn telling Mueller about the president's private efforts to fire Mueller? It's quite a question. Well, today Donald Trump claims he's not concerned about it, while another former Trump lawyer, John Dowd, insists Trump doesn't actually need to face Mueller at all.
Any concern about what he said to the Mueller team?
No, not at all.
Do you believe the president will eventually sit down with Bob Mueller based on your experience with him wanting to engage with counsel?
Well, there's no reason for the president to answer questions from Mueller. Mueller has all the answers. We gave him all the answers.
Now, we do know Bob Mueller disagrees with what you just heard there because he is pressing for the interview. The White House counsel, though, isn't always a job that defines the legitimacy or the future of a presidency, particularly when the presidency is healthy. The White House counsel doesn't tend to be a household name. But when the counsel is testifying against the president amidst an independent prosecutor probe, like John Dean there on the left, or defending actions that other officials identified as, say, illegal surveillance or unconstitutional torture, like Alberto Gonzales, or spending days with Bob Mueller to offer the most private details of the president's state of mind amidst potential obstruction, like Don McGahn there on the right, well, then, yes, the actions and the departure of that White House counsel can have a bearing on the making or unmaking of a presidency. And with that in mind, we turn to an excellent panel tonight. Maya Wiley, a former counsel to another chief executive, the mayor of New York City, and an MSNBC legal analyst for us. David Frum, a former speechwriter for George W. Bush, who did serve in that same administration as Gonzales, and also an author of Trumpocracy and an editor of The Atlantic, and former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance. Quite a panel for quite a day at the White House. Maya, your view of the significance of Mr. McGahn's departure, a man who Rachel and I and others have noted seems like quite the hero if you believe his own leaks.
So it is news, certainly. I don't think that we're going to see any major shifts in how this investigation is going to be handled through the White House because, of course, McGahn has not been the primary lawyer handling the Russia investigation for the White House. So that we're not going to see a major shift in strategy, I think, for this was in posture. I think what we have to understand is McGahn was actually part of the mission critical team. What I mean by that is he made it his job to accomplish Trump's mission.
But let me push you on the posture. There is a view here that Trump wants to get Mueller fired. The New York Times reported it. McGahn was reported as the obstacle. Donald Trump hasn't necessarily changed his mind about that. The interpretation here would be that McGahn, who was the barrier for that, has been removed. What about that theory?
Look, here's the point. The president is the president, and nobody can stop him from making a decision to remove someone he wants to remove. So just because a counsel says, don't do it, doesn't mean he has to listen. He should listen, because having a lawyer is like having a doctor. You don't want a doctor telling you, oh, you don't want to know you have brain cancer? Okay, I'll tell you you don't have brain cancer, even though you do. You want a lawyer to say, I'm going to tell you what you don't want to hear. It would be a bad decision. I'm going to tell you I may make a decision to leave if you make that bad decision. That's basically what we know about the interaction between Donald Trump and Don McGahn. So I actually think Don McGahn has been on the outs for a long time in the White House. I suspect this is more to the extent the timing is happening now about the fact that obviously Donald Trump could not have been too happy about McGahn talking to Mueller in the way reading
the details that he provided. So let me go to David Frum. Maya refers to a doctor treating a cancer. It was another White House counsel, John Dean, who talked about a cancer on the presidency. Your view of where Don McGahn fits into some of these famous counsels?
Well, there are two broad types of people who tend to end up in the White House counsel job. One type of person, like Lloyd Cutler under Jimmy Carter, are lawyers who have earned enormous reputations before entering the White House, who are brought in by presidents, knowing that this person has the prestige and the strength and the independence to be able to say no to the president. And if the president doesn't like what he's hearing, the counsel will walk out the door and go back to his big job on Wall Street or K Street in Washington. The other broad type of counsel are those like John Dean, as he was in the Nixon administration, who are people who come with really almost no previous national reputation, whom the president can rely on the president doesn't have to worry will say no, whom the president can count on to say yes, as White House counsel John Dean, to his later cost, did say yes. Don McGahn is basically a John Dean, entered as a John Dean, and is hoping to become a Lloyd Cutler by strategically leaking along the way. And the question we are all going to discover is which of those identities is the more true to what really happened.
It's fascinating when you put it like that. I think you're in agreement with my colleague Rachel Maddow's analysis as well. Let's take a listen to that for Joyce.
Don McGahn, all of a sudden, is the subject of a lot of news stories in terms of him having restrained the president from his worst or potentially most unconstitutional impulses around the Russia investigation and obstruction of justice. Makes Don McGahn like the picture of heroic self-sacrifice here, right?
Joyce, your take?
It's interesting to see the president go through lawyers faster than a chain smoker goes through cigarettes. I mean, McGahn is just leaving to this steady drumbeat of lawyers departing. But this one, Ari, you're right, because there's been so much publicity surrounding it, and it's cut both ways. On the one hand, there's this effort to cast McGahn in a good light, the person who's gone and been the bright line between Trump and some serious misdeeds. On the other hand, there's been this story that he's parted ways with the president, the story that he spoke with Bob Mueller for over 30 hours, implying that the president didn't know what he talked about, but that it would have been issues close to the presidency. But one thing that we all know is that McGahn has been central to the president's success in getting federal judges confirmed. I would not be too quick to take that leap of faith that says that McGahn is on the outs with the president. We have seen reports, though, that he's been hesitant on the issue of giving Paul Manafort a pardon. It's possible that much as the president was perceived by many to be signaling to Manafort last week that a pardon was a possibility when he spoke of Manafort favorably, perhaps he's saying McGahn is leaving, a pardon is again being dangled in a direction that the president may feel some pressure with the upcoming September trial for Manafort.
Well, you're nailing that, as you so often do, because that was the other context, David. There were these leaks, as Joyce refers to, that basically, if this was we talk about fireable offenses, this may have been a, quote, resignable offense in the sense that McGahn has drawn a red line over certain things. And Donald Trump's response, reportedly, was great. Then you can go, and I'll get someone who will carry out a pardon order.
Well, look, all through the Trump administration, that we are calling what used to be down now up. So obviously, it's better not to issue brazenly self-serving pardons than to issue brazenly self-serving pardons. But, you know, it was only in the last administration and all the administrations going back before that, going back to Watergate, that the idea that the president would use the pardon power in his own interest at all was completely alien. I mean, from Watergate until the end of the Obama administration, the pardons were run not by the president, but by the Department of Justice that would do an elaborate system of vetting, recommendations. The president and his staff would, of course, make the final decisions. But it was not a personal prerogative of the presidency in the way that it has become. And the fact that Don McGahn has said, look, don't horribly abuse this personal power of the presidency in such an obvious way, doesn't mean that it's still not something you resign over when the president on the very first day says, we're not doing this through the Department of Justice. This is my prerogative. I'm using it my way.
Joyce?
I think that that's a good analysis of the situation. No president has ever tried to use the pardon for his own benefit. And here Trump is perhaps using it defensively, trying to keep damaging information about himself or his family from coming to light. So it's unprecedented in many ways. It would make sense that McGahn, trying to protect the presidency, because he is, after all, as White House counsel, the presidency's lawyer and not the president's lawyer, that he would be trying to preserve those time-honored sort of practices and ensuring that the future of the presidency was not led down a different path by the conduct of this president.
And I would offer one amendment, which is, I think, a fair reading of the history, is that other presidents have certainly been criticized for struggling to use the pardon power in a uniform or non-self-interested way. Bush, in the administration you served, David, was criticized for using the commutation power, so that Scooter Libby didn't face the same accountability that almost any other defendant would face. Bill Clinton, in pardoning Mark Rich in an unusual way when he was still a fugitive and was seen as linked to the Clintons. And then obviously Bush Sr. Pursuant to Iran-Contra. I think one difference, though, that is so much more severe in degree, which does reinforce the points you both made, and Maya, I'll leave with you briefly, is the notion that those were all debatable prudential decisions that people said was too close. But the notion of family or self-pardons has never been on the table before.
It's never been on the table before, and I'm not going to give Don McGahn the credit that he just got. I actually think if you're being the lawyer that McGahn has always been, which is a on-Trump mission and an aggressive lawyer for Donald Trump. Remember, he was his campaign lawyer, and he was very aggressive with the FEC. This is a guy who, if he is doing his job, which I think he did in this instance, is say, don't do it because it's actually going to beef up the case against you.
Right.
Not don't do it because I'm really trying to protect the history of how pardons are used.
Well, there is a saying that if Don McGahn were freestyling, he wouldn't need a hype man. Because he does so much hyping himself. That's something that has been said in legal circles in Washington. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.